Let's take a look at some questions from the past papers. So here we have a pseudocode description and a pseudocode statement. So we have to kind of link the corresponding statements. Okay. A loop that will always iterate at least once. That will always iterate means that will run at least once. Okay, just remember, iteration means that something that is done time and again. So all loops, are kind of, you know, we iterate through the loops. We go through them time and time again. Okay, so that will run at least once, and that would be the repeat until loop. That would be the repeat until loop. Why that is the case? Because remember, we have post condition loops and precondition loops. A post condition loop is one, for example, the repeat until loop. It has these two boundaries, right? And here we have something like until count becomes equals to 30, something like this, right? This is how, these are the two boundaries of the loop, right? And this is where the condition is. So if you had something here, for example, input marks, and you had some code written here, this is the first statement that the processor will execute. Then the processor will come to this statement, and here this is the start of the loop, right? This is one of the starting boundaries. This is the starting boundary of the loop. But you notice there is no condition here. There is no condition written here, which means to enter this loop you do not require anything. There is no condition here, right? So no matter what the case, the processor will go inside the loop and execute whatever statements we have written inside here, because there is no condition specified at the start of the loop. So we'll definitely, if we're coming from here, right, we're coming downwards, the processor is executing all the instructions, and then it comes to this repeat statement. It knows that the loop is starting, but there is no condition given here. The repeat until statement has its condition in the last statement, right? The lower boundary. So this is where we're going to check whether this loop is going to run one more time or not. This is where the condition is at. This is a post condition loop. So the condition is only checked once we reach the lower boundary of the loop. So when the processor is coming down executing instructions, it comes to this loop. There is no condition given here. Therefore, the processor will automatically enter the loop, execute all the instructions, and then come to this lower boundary, this final statement, and decide whether this loop needs to be run one more time or not. So this post condition loop will always run at least once. All post condition loops will always run at least once. Okay, compared to post condition loops, you have precondition loops. For example, for I is equal to 1 to 5 and next, and you have something written inside here. This loop uh, is a precondition loop because the condition given to run the loop is at the starting boundary of the loop. This lower boundary does not have a condition here, right? The condition is given at the start of the loop. So this is called a precondition loop. This is called a precondition loop. Likewise, while x is less than 5 and while, you can notice now that this is also a precondition loop. Before we enter the loop, right? Before we enter the loop, the processor, for example, we have something like input marks here, right? Input marks. Before we enter, the processor is going to first execute this instruction, then come to this instruction. So before we enter the loop, as the processor is coming down executing all the instructions here, when the processor comes to this point, it will first check this condition out and then decide whether this loop is going to run or not. So this is a precondition loop. This is a precondition loop. Okay, next it says a conditional statement to deal with many possible outcomes. The answer to this one is case of. Okay. Uh, by the way, it could also be, uh, I this should no, there should be no confusion here. This could also be uh, this is also a conditional statement, and we can use this to deal with many possible outcomes. But I just want to make a slight distinction here. So it's the same problem that we have, that we've uh, solved using case of as well as the if else if selection statements, right? Both of these are basically selection statements, right? So case of is also selection, is an example of selection statements, and if else is also basically these are also selection statements. Okay, so what the code basically is doing here is we're basically asking the user to input a value in this variable day, and the user is going to he should enter a value between 1 to 7, right? If the user enters a value between 1 to 7, then you can see here that this case of statement is being applied on this day variable, okay, which basically means what? In case day has a value of 1, print Monday. In case day has a value of 2, print Tuesday. In case day has a value of 3, print Wednesday. 4 would print Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So this is how you write a case of statement, right? You write case of, put the variable in between, and this is where you write the different values. For example, if day has a value of 1, Monday will be printed. If day has a value of 5, Friday will be printed. So that's how we've set up our case statement. And if we don't get a value between 1 and 7, if the user inputs a different value in this variable day, then if all of these cases 1 to 7, if if the user has entered a different value than 1 to 7, then this otherwise statement is executed. And here you can see we're printing a message that you've entered an invalid day number, right? And this is where the case statement is ending. The if else statement obviously is very easy to understand. One difference, and both of these two pseudocodes are basically trying to do the same thing. This is the same solution, only in one case we are using the if else, else if, else selection structure, and in the other case we're using the case of otherwise end case statement, right? One notable difference you can see here is, because we have a large number of options here, we have 7 options here, and then this is the 8th option. There is a possibility of selecting one out of these 8 options, right? And similarly we have all of those 8 options here too. You can see that this code is written much more neatly. It is much more readable, it is much more neat, it is much more concise, whereas this code seems to be a bit more lengthy, right? So whenever we have a large number of options, let's say 8 values to choose from, or 10 values to choose, 10 different statements to choose from, or 20 or 30 different statements to choose from, then this code is going to become very lengthy. Whereas this code will be much easier to read, it's written much more concisely. So case of statements are used where we have to select one statement out of a very large number of possible options, right? And if else, generally, if we have a very very large number of options from which we have to select only one statement, then we prefer using case of instead of if else. So basically both of these are selection statements, right? Case of and if else, both of these are selection statements. However, case of is preferred when we have a large number of options to choose from, because this way you can write the code much more concisely, much more neat, and much smaller code as compared to the if else selection statement. Therefore, keeping in mind this statement, when we see that it says that a conditional statement to deal with many possible outcomes, so he's saying many possible, a large number of possible outcomes, then this seems to be the more appropriate choice as compared to this one. Therefore, we're not going to choose this. because we have a large number of possible outcomes and we have to choose one out of those large outcomes. Case of seems to be much more preferable. Okay. Uh, a loop that will always iterate a set a number of times, that will always run a number of times, that would be the for loop, right? Because that's how you write the for loop. For I equals 1 to 5, which means what? This loop will run multiple times. It will run at least 5 times, right? So this should be the for loop, right? Not necessary that the while loop will always run. For example, if we give x a value of 10 and we write a while loop such that while x is less than 10, do something like input marks, right? Input marks end while. This loop will not even run once, because when the processor comes here, it sees that x has a value of 10. And how have we set up our loop? While x has a value of less than 10. So x already has a value equal to 10, or let's make it 100, right? X has a much larger value than 10. X is not less than 10, so this condition is false. Because this condition is false, this loop is not going to run. So if you consider this scenario, this loop might never run at all, because x has a value of 100, right? And this condition will be false. Okay, so this loop will always run multiple times, more than once. So that's why we've selected this for to next loop. Repeat until loop may run once. It will definitely run once, but we're not sure if it's going to run a second time or not, right? So the repeat until loop here, for example, x has an initial value of 1, then the processor comes, it sees that this is the start of a loop, it goes and prints hello on the screen, right? It outputs hello. Then the value of x is incremented by 1. X becomes equals to 2, right? Because it was initially 1, and on this statement, when the processor executes this statement, x becomes equals to 2, right? And what are we trying to say here? We're saying repeat this loop until x becomes equals to 2. So the way this loop is set up, it is only going to run one time, right? So there is no guarantee that it's going to run a large number of times. It can only run once, it can run more than once also, but the way this loop is set up right now, it will only run one time. Therefore, the way this statement is set up, a loop that will iterate a set number of times would be this for next loop. You know, uh, while loop, we've already covered in the other loops we've also covered, right? A conditional statement with different outcomes for true and false. Okay. A conditional statement with different outcomes for true and false. By the way, I just explained the differences between the for loop, the while loop, and the repeat until loop. But one difference I didn't explain, and let me explain that first before we move on to the next statement. Just one difference that we should note is that the for loop here we are sure will run 5 times, right? We are sure it's going to run 5 times. And always, whenever you set up a for loop, you always give an initial value of y and you always give a final value of y. Final value of I, right? So you can write something like 55 here, then we know that this loop is going to run 55 times. So there's always a set number of times that this loop is going to run. Look at this repeat loop. We don't know how many times this is going to run. It can be set up such that we don't know how many times this loop is going to run, because each time this loop runs, we are going to input a value of x and we're going to print hello, and finally the processor is going to check if x has a value of -1. Remember, x was just input, right? So we don't know whether the user input a value of -1 or what different value he input, right? So this loop can run again. For example, if the user entered something like 7, right, this loop will come to this condition, and here the processor is going to check, has x become equals to -1? The answer is no, because x has a value of 7, right? So this loop will run again. Next time loop runs, user inputs a value of 4. So when the processor comes to this line, he checks this condition, has x become equals to minus 1, and the answer is no, so this loop will run again, right? So this loop will keep running as long as the user does not input a value of minus 1, right? He doesn't give a value of minus 1 to x. So we don't know when is that going to happen. So we are not sure how many times this loop runs. Not sure how many times this loop is going to run. And likewise, in this case also, you can see that x has an initial value of 0, and the condition to run the loop is that while x is not equal to 1, this is the not equals to sign. While x is not equal to 1, this loop is going to run, we're going to print hello, and then we're going to input a value of x. Then, once again, it will be checked whether x has a value not equal to minus 1. So if a user gives something like 4, x gets a value of 4, this loop will run again. So as long as x is not equal to minus 1 and the user keeps inputting values like 5, 7, 10, 20, 30, as long as x gets these input values which are not equal to 1, this loop will keep running. So we are not sure how long this loop is going to run. It is going to stop only when the user is going to input minus 1 as a value of x, right? So we are not sure how many times this loop is going to run. So these two loops, the repeat until loop and the while and while loop, can be set up such that we are not sure how many times that these loops are going to run. However, the for loop is always going to be set up such that we know at the start, at the very beginning, how many times this loop is going to run, because we always give the starting value and always give the final value of our loop control variable, which is in this case, which is I, right? So we're saying I, as long as I is between 1 to 55, this loop will keep running. So this for loop always runs a set number of times. So now we know why we selected, this for loop as an option, because it says here that this one is always going to run a set number of times. And finally, a conditional statement with different outcomes for true and false. Well, we can now go for this one. We can also go for this one. Case of, kind of works the same way. So either one of these two options is true, but if the question says that we can only pick one option, right? If the question says that each of these statements must be linked to a different option, then because we've already selected case of, this one needs to be linked to a different option, then in that case we're going to link it here. Okay, so if the question specifies it to be that way.